Our New Testament lesson for this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Now he was teaching on the Sabbath in one of the synagogues, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. This is the gospel of grace. One of my favorite authors is named Barbara Brown Taylor, and she's a wonderful preacher as well. And one of the books that she has written is called An Altar in the World. Barbara Brown Taylor retired from her life as an Episcopal priest a few years ago, and she recounts in An Altar in the World her first Sunday after stepping away from the pulpit. And so this first Sunday, she found herself at home without a parish to lead for the first time in 20 years. And she says that she confronted grand questions about her professional identity, her human worth, and her status before God. But that only lasted about an hour. After that, she went to the front porch and said morning prayer with the birds. Then she read until lunchtime. And then she made an egg sandwich and took a nap. By the time the sun went down, she realized that she had just observed her first true Sabbath in more than 20 years. And so now she has made a practice of saying no for one whole day a week. She says no to work, to commerce, to the internet, to the car, to the voice in her head that is always whispering more. One day each week, more God is the only thing on her list. Taylor's revelation reminds us of the original model of the Sabbath. Go back to the beginning with me, the very beginning of it all, where Genesis tells us that God created the earth and the heavens in 6 days. And on the seventh, God rested. On the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. That sounds a little redundant from Genesis, but the message is clear that God rested on that seventh day. And God hallowed the seventh day. He made it holy and set it apart. The Sabbath was the very first sacred thing in all creation. And that sacred time was reaffirmed in Exodus chapter 20, where we find it as fourth among the 10 Commandments. Keeping the Sabbath and honoring it was how Israel would mark themselves as people made in God's image, and as people called into a special and sacred covenant with the God who had freed them from Egypt. But we have to be careful in how we keep the Sabbath. It is sanctified and sacred and set apart. But we can't get too caught up in the holiness of the Sabbath that we miss its purpose. The Sabbath calls us away from the world so that we can become more like God. And the God who is holy is also the God who comes near. We can't become so set apart that we lose touch with each other. That's when we stop seeing the needs right in front of us. Isaiah says that Israel had become distracted, that they had lost sight of who they were and the God that they served. Just for a little context, at this point in Israel's history, they have just returned from a Babylonian exile. They've just moved back into their homeland. And Jerusalem remains in ruins from before their departure. And Israel is struggling to regain their sense of identity as a people returned to their homeland. It seems that their spiritual lives are as wrecked as the rubble around them. A careful reading of Isaiah 58 gives us a picture of the problems the prophet sees in the community. He begins by noticing their relationship to God was not what it should be. The people were fasting, but God didn't seem to pay attention. In fact, what should have been days of worship turned out to be times of fighting and hypocrisy. And they were not observing the Sabbath days, but using them for their own interests and gain. Nor was their relationship to their neighbor what it should be. Wealthy citizens were oppressing their workers and were not even paying them minimum wages. People with property and money should have been caring for the hungry and the homeless in their community, but instead they neglected them. Neglecting worship and day-by-day religion, commercializing the Sabbath, not caring for the poor and needy, these are all problems the prophet had to address. And he does so by calling the people to remember the importance of the Sabbath. God calls us to delight in the Sabbath, to honor it. Sabbath actually means to stop. To stop. Sabbath is intended for us to take a break, to rest, to set down the burdens of the week and dwell in the abiding presence of our liberator and redeemer, our creator and our keeper. And in order for us to truly honor the Sabbath, there are some things that God calls us to stop. Well, Patrick, what does God call us to stop? I'm glad you asked. Because Isaiah names a few things for us. First on his list is the pointing of the finger and the speaking of evil. Stop blaming each other. Stop bad-mouthing one another, Isaiah says. Israel had moved back in, returning from a long exile so that they could live as God's people once again. And what do they end up doing? They're blaming each other. And while Israel quarrels amongst themselves, there are people. There are real people with real struggles like homelessness and poverty and hunger and sickness, people who go unnoticed, who go unseen, who go unheard and uncared for. And instead of remembering their responsibility to love their neighbors as themselves, which is part of the Levitical law, the wealthy and the powerful are bickering about who should make the first move. And their infighting only makes a mockery of their worship together. Isaiah offers us a different glimpse of what it means to honor the Sabbath. Not only as a day and a time set apart to commune with God and with each other, but also as a way to confront our failings and live out the commandment to take care of each other. Because if we acknowledge God on the Sabbath and yet ignore our neighbors, neglect the poor, and oppress the vulnerable during the week, and folks, that holy hour on Sunday isn't worth much. It's trampled on like a dirty sandal underfoot, left behind in the dust and the mud. None of us can truly worship God while fighting with another person, and especially not while willfully ignoring the needs of others around us. Instead of blaming others and saying nasty things about them, Isaiah says it's our turn to be part of the solution. The work for God's justice on earth requires us to take responsibility for our own actions and to avoid accusing others. At times, we may blame others inaccurately and unjustly. At other times, we may hurl accusations in order to deflect attention from our own faults, and that further damages the opportunities to work for reconciliation and restitution. I heard a preacher say one time, "I do good to keep my own front porch clean." I think that's what Isaiah is trying to remind us of our own responsibility to act on what we can change in ourselves. More than this, though, I think Isaiah is calling his people to stop pretending. Stop pretending. I used to love when Halloween would come around. For that one night every year, I could put on a costume, I could become someone else for the evening, and get rewarded for it. When I was 5, I dressed up like a prince, complete with a crown, a purple sash, and a plastic sword. And 2 years later, I dressed up like a police officer, and a real policeman who lived down the street let me sit in his car and turn the lights on. But by far, my favorite costume was when I got to become my favorite superhero, Superman. In my mind, I was Christopher Reeve all over again. Those were the fun days. But I knew that when I took off the cape and set down the candy bucket, that it was time to go back to reality. It's not that much different for Israel here. Isaiah says they're playing dress up on the Sabbath. They're pretending in their worship of God. They attend the weekly ritual at their synagogue, but they make it more about themselves than they do God. They go their own ways. They serve their own interests and pursue their own affairs. Their worship of God is hypocrisy, plain and simple. Jesus found the same kind of hypocrisy in the synagogue in Luke 13. As Jesus was teaching, a woman showed up to worship. She was crippled, bent over, and quite unable to stand up straight. In word and in touch, Jesus freed this woman from her ailment, and she stood all the way up and began praising God. After she was healed, the leader of the synagogue was outraged that Jesus had dared to cure her on the Sabbath and in the synagogue. This leader was only pretending to truly worship God, but this woman was not pretending at all. This woman's posture was real, her pain was real, and her praise was real. For her, it was all real. She brought her full self into that synagogue to worship God and to hear Jesus teach. Even though she may have been ostracized and marginalized time and time before, she still came that day with no pretense about who she was. So on the Sabbath, God wants us to show up without pretending. Bring your pain. Bring your burdens. Bring your bent-over posture. The synagogue leader had become like the Israelites in Isaiah. He's so wrapped up in ritual and the right ways of following the law that he has become disconnected from the needs of the people that are right in front of him. Jesus wants to show him that he's missing the heart of the Sabbath, the heart of God's law, the heart of the tradition. What the leader misses is compassion, the kind of compassion that overcomes legalism every single time. the kind of compassion that doesn't cling to tradition simply for tradition's sake, the kind of compassion that consistently sees the broken body, the broken soul, the broken spirit before it sees the broken commandment. There are some things we know about this woman. We know that she was in pain. We know that she was bent over. And we know that she was healed. And we're not even told her name. But when the synagogue leader rebuked her and Jesus gives her one. He called her a daughter of Abraham. This person who came to worship God may look different from you. She may walk differently than you. She may be differently abled than you, and she's part of your family. It's your responsibility, especially on this day and in this place, to see her as created and beloved by the God we gather to worship together. And Jesus doesn't stop at freeing the woman. He restores her to community, to her community. At the same time, he calls on that community to repent of its hypocrisy and narrow-mindedness and embrace her as one of their own. Not as an object of pity or of scorn, but as a daughter, as an heir, as a human being worthy of both love and dignity. When we truly honor the Sabbath, not only do we stop what we're doing to remember who God is, but we remember who we are. We stop pretending that we know it all. We stop pretending that we're perfect. We stop pretending that we're standing straight up. Because there are things in life that burden us all down. If we will stop pretending and be honest about who we are this morning, I think we'll all find ourselves bent over in some way. From a job that's wearing us down, from a relationship that just isn't quite what it used to be, from worries and concerns about our country or our family, from the hectic pace that comes with a new school year. There are burdens we carry that make all of us bend over. But the promise of the gospel this morning is that when we bend over in the presence of Jesus, he lays his hands on us to help us stand back up, to free us from that posture, to liberate us from our pain, to join us in praise of God. But only when we come authentically with who we are to the house of God. No pretending, no dress up, no disguise. Show up fully and let God set you free. When we do, we'll find new life and new praise, like the woman in the synagogue and Israel in Isaiah 58. When we walk with God in the ways he calls us, Isaiah prophesies, then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in parched places and make your bones strong. Then you shall delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride upon the heights of the earth. And, O God, let that new dawn break